While there have been endless analysis of the Blair Witch Project, right back to the initial release of the movie in 1999, concerning its hidden meanings and underlying mysterious and deliberately unresolved plot, this video will be one more flavour thrown into that mix of theories surrounding the hidden depths and undercurrents of this remarkable found footage movie. For this analysis, I will work within the framework of European folklore, and while the Blair Witch Project is indeed very much an American Sylvan supernatural horror tale, my reason for taking this approach is based upon a 1999 mockumentary created in tandem by the movie producers entitled The Curse of the Blair Witch. Within the legend outlined in The Curse of the Blair Witch mockumentary, it is specifically mentioned that the original legend goes back to that of an Irish immigrant woman who was made outcast by the community and lived alone in the deepest reaches of the forest as a powerful witch. This is a very common story within European folklore. This revelation outlined in The Curse of the Blair Witch mockumentary opened up a whole other lexicon in order for which us to examine the Blair Witch Project movie itself with fresh eyes. This is not to say the themes and concepts presented here could not have been resolved within a Native American framework by utilizing the legends and mythologies of the First Nations peoples. They most certainly could. However, Europeans who emigrated to North America and settled in landscapes which were not unlike Northern and Western Europe also took their magic archetypes and folklore along with them, and then grounded or embedded them into the similar landscapes of the New World. This is why you have a strong belief in the she-fairies of the Celtic world in Newfoundland, and Germanic folklore and magic in parts of rural Pennsylvania. One of the reasons I feel that the Blair Witch Project captured the imagination and subconscious minds of so many people is due to the fact that the deliberate lo-fi production and erratic camera work took a certain comfortable romanticism away from the forest landscape and reminded the viewers of our ancestral encoding of a time when humans considered the woodlands and great forest to be literally another realm in which humans had to adapt to a very different level of consciousness while in the deepest domains of the densely forested landscape. And it has to be said, an extremely dangerous realm where everything under the canopy of the trees eats everything else, including the lost traveller. Set in and around the pivotal date of Halloween 1994, the dating of the movie's plot and occurrences takes place during the Irish festival of Samhain, when the veil between realities and states of consciousness are accessible both to and from this dimension and into that of otherworldly realms. Communication and interaction with spiritual forces not normally accessible can take place at the end of October and the start of November. In the Blair Witch Project, 3 film students, Heather, Mike and Josh, embark upon creating a documentary film concerning the legend of the Blair Witch within the vast woodlands on the outskirts of Burkittsville, Maryland. During remarkably believable interview segments with locals, they are told about a hermit who lived in the woods and who kidnapped 7 children in the 1940s. He then murdered them all in pairs while they were forced to stand facing a wall in the basement of a house deep inside the interior of the forest. As the 3 film students begin to make their way into the woods, they encounter 2 fishermen, of which one warns them that the woods are cursed. They are then told the story of a young girl named Robin Weaver who vanished in 1888. 3 days later, and upon her return, she recounted meeting an old woman whose feet never touched the ground. It is by means of these fake interviews that lends the movie its remarkable plausibility, and why so many people were willing to believe the movie was an actual real account and not a fictional one. Following this encounter with the fishermen, Heather, Mike and Josh hike as far as Coffin Rock to shoot a segment for the documentary at a location where 5 men were found ritualistically murdered in the 19th century. Then they cross a flowing river. This is a pivotal scene, as the crossing of rivers is very symbolic within woodland mythology, as it represents a literal crossing of the abyss or psychic threshold into another realm whereby modernity and the human condition faces challenges not normally encountered in normal life. The 3 students are now in another reality where modern civilization has no power to safeguard them. They then spend their first night camping in the woods, and the following day find an old cemetery with 7 stone piles. This is the first hint that things are not quite right, as their first night in the forest has altered their consciousness and even their jovial personalities, which they demonstrated up to this point in the movie, and their personalities now begin to shift. Josh accidentally knocks over one of the piles of stones, and the first hints of superstition and even paranoia now take root. A night spent in the woods can be as much of a psychedelic experience as taking entheogens, and every noise and sensation is amplified by our nervous system into an extremely heightened state of awareness. Hence why Mike, Josh and Heather now seem less relaxed and more pensive as they enter deeper into the woods. Waking up the following morning after a night spent in the woods, people often find themselves change. The environmental and psychological relationship with the forest takes on a far more serious and primal element. Something that would not happen if one ventured into the forest on a day trip, arriving and returning in daylight. The imagination runs wild in response to any movement or noise outside the fragile walls of the tent. These strange sounds, these mysteries, these unknown sources then become phantoms of speculation and primal fears. And this we assume happens on the second night in the woods, as they hear the sound of twigs snapping outside the tent, as if they are being trampled underfoot or being broken by a pair of hands. Having become dissatisfied and understandably spooked, the following morning they try to make their way back to the car but are unable to find it. This leads them to their third night in the woods, and again, once more accompanied by the sound of twigs snapping, which could be a wild animal or could be someone doing it on purpose. In the morning, upon waking, they find 3 piles of stones have been built around their tent. Soon after, Heather realizes their only map is missing. Amazingly, and out of nowhere, Mike confesses, in a state halfway between guilt and gloating, that he kicked the map into the river out of frustration of them constantly being lost. It is also revealed by his behaviour that Mike is struggling to remain psychically integrated, as if another life force is attempting to take over his mind. Josh and Heather then attack Mike in anger, as the serious predicament of their situation is now fully apparent. They are lost. Without a map and being surrounded by the continuing strange nocturnal sounds and events around them. With the aid of a compass, they all begin to head south. It is important to point out that it is Mike who has the compass, and Heather and Josh are assuming he is actually leading them south. At this point, they encounter the movie's most iconic visual symbol, that being of the creepy humanoid stick figures suspended from trees, created presumably by the branches they had heard being cracked on the previous nights. When they again return to their tent for the night, once more the environment around them is filled with strange sounds, like children's voices, while the tent shakes violently of its own accord. All 3 run into the woods in panic and wait for sunrise. They then find their camp has been trashed. However, they still pick up everything and continue to travel south, according, and this is important, once more to Mike's directions. Soon they come to a river and realise they have been moving all day in circles. They are trapped in this woodland realm and cannot see crossing back over to the river is their only means of salvation from their situation. At this point, Josh falls apart, feeling that the situation is now hopeless, and the following morning he leaves Heather and Mike so as to attempt to make his own way out of the woods. That night, the sound of what could be Josh is heard screaming in agony and terror, and it fills the woods, but neither Heather nor Mike can locate him. Now firmly believing that the witch is mimicking Josh in distress in order to lure out Mike and Heather. This quote-unquote witch could possibly be wild animals, the two students, that sound like Josh but actually isn't. Or maybe it's an otherworldly sound created out of the abyss. The story of the Banshee, the screaming Irish fairy associated with Samhain and Halloween, is a real possibility here. Upon waking and in a state of near nervous breakdown, Heather finds a bundle of twigs tied with a torn piece of Josh's shirt. Inside she finds parts of his flesh and blood. Heather then makes the interesting choice to not inform Mike about this as she no longer trusts him. Did Mike lose the map on purpose? Did Mike give them the wrong compass bearings? Did Mike create the stone piles and stick figures while Heather and Josh were sleeping? These would have been the questions now swirling around inside Heather's head. Realizing she is almost certainly doomed that night, Heather makes a farewell video to the families, assuming that all three will perish in the woods. Then once more Josh's screams are heard, as if he is calling out for help or rescue. Then following the sounds to an abandoned house, resplendent with magical symbols and children's bloody handprints on the wall, they are now literally in the belly of the Blair Witch beast. After a chaotic scene of running around the old house, they both make their way to the basement, and there Mike drops his camera, apparently having been hit or attacked. Heather enters in behind Mike and in extreme terror observes Mike facing the basement wall. Then Heather is attacked by an unseen force and her camera falls on its side and the movie ends. Considering all that has taken place up until this point, it would appear that Mike was the one who got all three lost in the forest. There must have been something within his personality which allowed the spiritual force of the woods to take control of him as soon as they crossed over the river and into the deepest parts of the woods. Within European folklore, there is a strong belief that natural landscapes contain a sentient consciousness of their own, and that this environomicon can literally possess an individual. Lakes can draw people into them in order for them to be drowned, so as to release into the ecosystem of the lake new nutrients. And this is what happened to Mike. As they became increasingly lost within the forest, his mind was taken over by the spirit of the forest, which caused him to kick their only map and means of survival into the river. He also practically boasts about it, and this is the dark spirit of the forest speaking through Mike so as to mock his other two colleagues. Then, being possessed, lies to them about which direction the compass is pointed and leads them in circles. He most certainly created the other charades of the stick figures and the piles of stone outside the tent when Heather and Josh were either asleep or could not see him in the dark. Heather, Mike and Josh were food and nutrients for the forest. As they go deeper into the woods, they are travelling through the digestive tract to be eventually killed and consumed within the abandoned house. Their bodies would have been removed and eaten by scavengers, only to become the manure to feed the trees and plants of the forest. This is why Josh's body parts were presented, again by Mike, almost like a meal in a knapsack, and Heather was correct in assuming it was Mike who created this gruesome packed lunch, bound in twigs, as all three were to meet the same fate, feeding the roots and branches of the woods later on. The Blair Witch may at one time have been an actual woman living in the woods, and again in European folklore there is a concept of the Wildendicken, a wild woman with magical powers who lives deep in the forest and is best avoided. Yet this is merely an allegory for what Heather, Mike and Josh discovered, the sentient, carnivorous, predatory nature of the ancient woodlands. The legend of the Blair Witch may well be a story created by the original residents of Burkittsville so as to stress the sentient carnivorous danger of the deepest part of the forest. This is why our ancient ancestors feared the old forests, choosing to live instead along the coasts. Everything in the forest wants to eat you, and if hungry enough and during certain times like Samhain, will stalk and hunt you too, while the opening of the door between realms allows it to psychically communicate and lure the foolish to their peril. This was Mike, and he delivered himself, Heather and Josh.